Good morning. Welcome to Housing California's 44th Annual Conference. We're thrilled to welcome you all to this year's event. If you are not seated and you are looking for a seat, please come on up. We have lots of tables up here in the front with plenty of seats. As we begin our conference, I'd like to acknowledge that our gathering is being held on the traditional lands of the Kumeyaay people and that connections of Indigenous peoples to this land continue today. There are 18 federally recognized tribes in San Diego County, more than any other county in the United States. And the county's tribal bands are part of 4 distinct cultural groups: the Kumeyaay, the Payam-Cowichom, the Cupeño, and the Cahuillo peoples. Of the 20,000 plus Native Americans who make up the tribal groups in San Diego County, only a small percentage live on reservation land. As we pursue the work of housing justice, the thing that's bringing us all together this morning, we have a responsibility to honor the tribal connections to the land. And as these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, we strive to understand our place within the past, present, and future of these Indigenous lands by reflecting on the relationships with human and non-human relatives with whom we are sharing this space. We offer gratitude to those who have stewarded this land over many other lands in California throughout generations. Over the next 2 days and beyond, I encourage us all to move beyond acknowledgement and really think about action, how we can take action to support Indigenous people, organizations, and communities by incorporating Indigenous voices and wisdom into our discussions and decision-making, by investing resources in Native communities and institutions, and by developing partnerships that allow us to deepen our solidarity with Native people and communities. Before moving into the next steps of our agenda and discussion, I actually want to pause for a minute and let you all reflect on how you might show up to support our Indigenous neighbors. In the app, the Whova app that you all have, we've loaded some resources. If you don't know who the Indigenous people are and the history of people in the land that you live in or work in, there's an app that can help you learn more about that. I encourage you, as you leave the conference, to think about and learn more about who the Native nations are that are closest to you, who the Native-led organizations are, and the work that they're doing in your community, to explore whether they're voluntary land tax programs or other programs that support Native sovereignty that you might support, and to generally reflect on how you can show up to be a partner, supporter, and ally for Native communities. With that, I'm going to move us into the rest of our day. My name is Shioni Flegel. I should have said that at the top. I'm the executive director at Housing California. I had the privilege of joining the organization about 6 months ago. I've worked with the Housing California team for about the last decade, first as a partner, then as a board member, and now in this role, and it's truly a privilege to be joining as executive director. My work really grew out of the racial justice movement. I spent most of my career working for Latino communities first, and then working for a national organization called PolicyLink that some of you know. I bring a deep commitment to racial justice. I was raised, some of you have heard me speak about this before, but I was raised in a small farm worker community in California's Central Coast, where many of our neighbors, my siblings, and others struggled to attain the most basic need of theirs, which is safe, stable, affordable housing. So it's really a privilege to be working on issues that directly impact my community and the family I come from. As many of you know, since 1988, Housing California has worked to create a California with homes, health, and prosperity for all people in thriving, sustainable communities. We serve Californians at risk of experiencing housing instability or homelessness because of inadequate and harmful policies of the past and present, because of economic dislocation and structural racism. We do that by bringing together diverse partners like all of you gathered in this room to end homelessness, increase the supply of safe, stable housing options, and reverse the legacy of racial and economic inequalities by building power among the people most impacted by housing injustice. I know we have an amazing group of Run leaders in the audience. If you're here, raise your hands. These folks are really doing phenomenal work to engage and change the discussion around housing, to shape policy, and to actually just build the engagement of people who are being impacted by California's housing crisis. We also, I think many of you know us for our policy work. We have a phenomenal team of partners and staff working to shift statewide policy, and increasingly find ourselves working to shape the narratives that influence how people think about housing in California. We know that many of the problems we're experiencing are reflections of deeply embedded values that have shaped how we've grown and developed as a country and as a state. In 2021, did I get the date right? We launched Roadmap Home 2030, a bold 10-year plan to build affordable housing, protect low-income renters, end homelessness, and advance racial and economic equity, and have done that really in partnership with all of you. You'll hear us talk more about this over the next couple of days, but that really is our North Star for our work. And as we pursue those goals, we're acutely aware that we cannot accomplish what we want without partnership with folks working in all parts of the housing movement. So as we move into the discussion with our panelists and plenaries, that theme will come up over and over. What does it actually take for us to leverage the collective strength, knowledge, power, and capacity of all those in the room and the folks who are back in our communities to really deliver on our vision of a California where all people have a place to call home? I look forward to working with all of you to create a powerful and aligned cross-sector movement that can respond to the immediate needs of our communities while doubling down on the crucial work to create long-term structural change. This conference is just one critical way that we work to bring together all of you, our network, to share bold ideas, build alliances, strengthen our collective leadership capacity, and move towards new ways of thinking, doing business, and achieving results. Without further ado, I want to dive into conference so we can all move to the exciting opening plenary. First, a huge thanks to our sponsors and the staff, consultants, volunteers, and Housing California's board for putting on this conference. Additional gratitude to the conveners and speakers and folks in the hall who took the time to come from their busy day to lend their insight and expertise, and our deep appreciation to the amazing hotel and conference center staff who clean, cook, and care for all of us while we're here. Finally, a huge thank you to all of you for joining us on this journey as we explore housing's next chapter and think about how we translate the energy, momentum, and urgency of this moment to a future where every California has safe, stable, affordable housing in a community where they can thrive. Before I introduce our board chair and officially launch into the conference, I want to review a few housekeeping items. First, we want to ensure you have a great conference experience. Our mobile app, Huva, is a great source of information. You can also get your questions answered at our info table or the check-in desk where you came in. For the safety of our guests, if you have COVID symptoms, please leave. Sorry. Wear a mask covering your face and mouth, except when you're eating or actively engaged as a presenter. Third, we're providing captioning and interpretation services during all plenaries. If you have Spanish or ASL interpretation needs, please visit us at the check-in table so we can make sure you get the support you need. If you need a vegetarian or vegan meal and did not get a colored dot on your name badge when you checked in, go to the information table in the Town and Country foyer to get one before lunch today. I encourage you to join other conference participants in the Town and Country foyer to engage in an interactive art installation from a wonderful San Diego-based artist. We're really leaning on you all to help us think about what it looks like to write housing's next chapter. So there's an art exhibit to help us do that together. And last, but certainly not least, we encourage you to visit the exhibit space and meet all of our amazing sponsors who make this event possible year after year. Now I'd like to invite our board chair, Housing California's board chair, David Howden, to the stage to provide a few remarks on behalf of the board of directors. Thank you again for coming to the conference. I hope you have a wonderful 2 days.
Good morning. A little bit louder. It's a little bit dark. I'm afraid you're going to go to sleep. I'm David Howden. I'm the director of the LA program for CSH, Corporation for Supportive Housing, and have the honor and privilege of serving as the president of the board for Housing California. And I'm excited to be here in sunny San Diego. It's the first time we've had the conference outside of Sacramento, so welcome and enjoy. I'm also very excited about the accomplishments of Housing California thus far, including, as Shioni mentioned, the development and release of the Roadmap Home, which provides a collective way forward for our sector, and the passage of critical legislation over many years that supported the affordable housing development and increased resources to solve homelessness. I'm equally excited about the opportunity before us, building upon the momentum and successes of the past for Housing California to continue to lead the sector and achieve even greater success. I think key to this will be building an even stronger, more inclusive coalition while we strengthen our core relationships and bring new allies, invite new allies into the coalition, including folks focused on tenant rights, racial equity, and other cross-sector partners, as well as centering the voices of those with lived experience as core allies, especially through the Residents United Network. I'm also very excited, along with the whole board of directors, to have Shioni Flago as our new executive director and leading the way. Shioni brings the right combination of experience, strength, and values that will lead and guide Housing California into the future. Finally, I'm excited to introduce Cecile Chalafour, a longtime friend and managing director for community development and commercial banking at Chase, one of our title sponsors and long-term supporters of the conference. Welcome, Cecile.
From large cities to rural communities throughout California, the Pacific Northwest, Arizona, Nevada, and Idaho, JP Morgan Chase believes impactful business starts with shared visions. Our community development banking group is dedicated to crafting customized solutions, helping you navigate complex, multi-layered financial deals with clarity and precision. Together, we make purposeful visions possible, because when your goals are built on a breadth of resources and foresight, they have the power to fuel economies and empower healthy communities. Good morning, everybody. I'm Cecile Chalafour. I'm the head of the West for JP Morgan Chase in community development real estate, meaning our affordable housing platform. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Oh my gosh, we're back to normal. We're all commenting on that earlier. What a crowd, and a smiling one at that. It's actually really nice to see everybody in the hallway, how all of us are so happy to be together again for real. So welcome. It's our pleasure, JP Morgan Chase's pleasure, to sponsor the Housing California Conference. And it's particularly my pleasure to do this, to congratulate Shioni on her first one. Look at that, you already have a big crowd of fans. All right. I was asked to talk a little bit about the next chapter from our perspective. So to give you a sense at Chase, I think we did about double last year what we used to do in affordable housing. For California, it's about short of $2 billion in construction financing alone. Sounds great, right? Big numbers. We are closing about a third of the accelerator deals. So, you know, from our perspective, we do our part. I know all of you are. Collectively, we're doing more than we have ever done in affordable housing, and that's fantastic. That's what we all wanted. Here's for the less glamorous part. What I see, what we all talk about in the hallways, what we all know, is the deals, not the project, but the deals, are getting harder. They're getting tighter. The numbers are not our best friends right now. We talk about costs, we talk about operating expenses, we talk about services because we are being asked more and more, as we should, but it's challenging, to help solve not only a housing crisis, but a mental illness crisis with housing and with housing dollars. And all of that is putting a lot of pressure on our projects. It's not the glamorous part to speak about, but that, you know, I mention it because the reality is right now we're having more money than we ever had in the whole state for affordable housing, and we're still short of producing enough units. And more importantly, we're really struggling with making the project sustainable. Why does it matter? None of us here in this room do housing just for the beautiful groundbreakings. We love them, right? But we're really building for the long terms. Our goals, every single one of us, is to bring assets to our communities that are there for the long term, with real affordable housing that can change the outcome for whole communities. And we're a little bit short on that one. So I know that's not the most uplifting thought for the beginning of the day, but okay. From there, the good news is, our industry, this room, is full of the best mind from a dedication perspective, from being smart, from being creative, right? We have the best people we could ever ask for to do things differently and keep thinking bolder and bigger. Think about like how many miracles did you do over the last 2 months, right? To just save a few more projects to make them happen, right? So we can bring those resources, that strength, to the next chapter and see how differently we could do things. Somebody last night, I was talking at one of the reception with one of our colleagues, and we were discussing, it's all about, you know, keep looking over the mountains. And for anybody who likes hiking, but sometimes struggle when you get towards the top, we all know, like, you made it right there, right? And you look at it and you're like, I swear that mountain got bigger. It looked a lot better earlier. But we keep going, right? And that's a little bit where we are. We just need to keep going and keep thinking a little bit broader and bolder. So thank you to Housing California for inviting us to take the time and space to think about the next chapter. I cannot wait to hear our panel of experts and see what they have to propose to us in terms of new ideas to get us started and see how we can engage over the next few months. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Fred Brackwell, the CEO of the San Francisco Foundation, to the stage. Thank you, everybody.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you this morning, and it's great to see a packed house to talk about these very important issues that we're going to discuss this morning. And to the panel, I'm going to introduce them in a second. I really encourage everybody to look at the bios. I'm not going to read all of them, but everybody has really diverse sets of experiences that they're going to be bringing to the conversation today. So welcome. I'm looking forward to talking to you all. You know, when I was thinking about this panel and we were talking about it in preparation and thinking about the next chapter, I was actually thinking about the current chapter and how that kind of sets us up for the conversations that we're going to be having over the next couple of days about the next chapter. And the current chapter, for me at least, has been kind of a tale of two worlds when it comes to the housing field and all the work that we are engaged in. On the one hand, a tremendous amount of progress has been made over the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, we've seen the kind of attention in Sacramento focused on housing that we haven't seen in a long time. We've seen new, exciting, innovative, and really forward-thinking legislation passed in Sacramento. We've seen new resources being brought to the table, both at the state and federal level. We've seen an openness of the voters to actually support a lot of affordable housing work at the local level, at the county level, at the regional level, and even at the state level. And then during the pandemic, what we saw and brought the really higher relief was the intersection of housing with so many of the issues that we're grappling with as a society. And so we've just seen, on the one hand, more attention focused on our field than we've ever seen before. But the other side of that coin is that progress doesn't seem to be, we're not making it at the scale that we need to or with the pace that we need to. And particularly during the pandemic, what we saw was inequality, inequity really widening, whether we're talking about from a racial or ethnic perspective or from an income point of view. So when I think about the last chapter, that's what I think about. And it feels to me like the next chapter really poses the question, how do we kind of harness the attention and resources that we've been afforded as a field and focus that in a way that produces the results that we want at the scale that we want for the communities that we serve. And how we do that across increasingly specialized and fragmented field of folks who are doing fabulous work, but everybody thinks they have the silver bullet. And so for me, I think that is what we want to interrogate a little bit. And, you know, to the audience, I'm going to warn you in advance, we're going to raise a lot of interesting questions, and we're not trying to solve them on this panel. And so what we're looking to do is kind of give you a little bit of energy, give you a little bit of provocative discussion for you to take with you over the next few days. And we're relying on the couple of thousand people who are going to be here to solve it for us. And so that's what we're focused in on. And I want to introduce the folks who are on this panel. As I said, I want you to really look at the bios, but we've really got a great group of folks here. First is Gustavo Velasquez, who's here in the middle. He's the director of HCD. Yeah, you can clap for him. Corinne Buchanan, who is the Deputy Secretary of Policy and Strategic Planning at the California Health and Human Services Agency. Welcome. Sociata Vuti, I think I got that right, Chief Operating Officer at Community Housing Works.
Yes.
Amanda Nderi, CEO of Funders Together to End Homelessness. And last but certainly not least, Pete White, Executive Director of Los Angeles Action Network. Welcome to all of you all. I want to ask a first question and allow you all to kind of weigh in on this one. And that is, you know, each of you are addressing the state's housing crisis from a different vantage point, different levels of altitude, different kinds of geography, different issues. And we think that I think the work and the different levels of work are really going to be important towards kind of reimagining our field and what we're trying to accomplish. And so from your vantage point, kind of what are your aspirations for housing's next chapter? And what's the future that you want to see for California, and what do you think is going to be critical towards getting us there? And maybe why don't I start in the middle with you, Sociata?
Sure. No pressure. But you know, you've already framed it that we're not here to solve today's problem, but to just pose it and generate more conversations. And so I think for me, I've been just kind of thinking about it. When I look into kind of housing for the future and what it looks like to me, if I shut my eyes and live in that reimagined space, it's not making it so complicated. It's really complicated, from putting together the projects, from the financing aspect of things, from if we finally met the hurdle of the financing piece of it, then it becomes the operations and making sure that lasts and the preservation of affordable housing. And so to me, making things less complicated. You know, I thought about the other day, I was driving down the 78 West, going towards Oceanside, you know, hilly community, and my son was probably no more than 7 years old. And he looks out the window and he asked me, you know, Mom, what are they building out there on the hills? And I said, oh, they're building housing. Like, oh, that's great. They're gonna build housing for homeless people. And I had to pause because I knew that's not why they were building the housing and who they were building it for. But I think about how uncomplicated that comment was and how we are I don't know if we're making things too complicated, that it really just is housing and people need a place to live. And so that's my future, is how can we make this more, less complicated than it really is today.
Gotcha, thank you. Gustavo.
Sure. Great to be here. Thanks, Fred, for that question. So it's aspiration and then what's critical to meet the next chapter for housing in California. Well, aspiration, I think you touched on it in your opening. It is to once and for all achieve fair and inclusive housing in our state. The pandemic created greater disparities than the ones we had before it. Think of, you know, persons with physical disabilities and visual impairments. Think of unsheltered people. Think of racial and ethnic minorities. Think of members of tribes. Think of migrant farm workers, seniors. There's so much disparities happening. And I feel that when I talk about fair housing, sometimes I pause and I think it's really as an aspiration, but it's also a legal obligation. And I sometimes I'm shocked by the lack of knowledge base sometimes that I see across some of our local communities, local governments, about the legal obligations to meet fair and inclusive housing. And in the state of California, we're blessed with the fact that we have incredibly progressive fair housing requirements in the books. Most of that, though, still is on paper. Arguably, a lot of the housing plans right now that HCD reviews and approves housing elements are still not fully in compliance because these local jurisdictions are having a hard time in fully analyzing and coming up with the strategies to overcome the sad legacy of residential segregation that we see in every community across the state. Mm-hmm. And we need to use those tools to overcome these patterns of segregation. Otherwise, the vitality and the beacon of hope that California is won't be anymore because of the rapidly changing demographics in our state. Now, what is critical is two things. One, just let's replicate what works. Gavin Newsom is the housing governor. No other governor before him put so much attention to the crisis of homelessness and housing as Gavin Newsom has. So because of that, we have enjoyed historic levels of investments in homelessness programs, in affordable housing. And because of that, it has given us an opportunity to experiment with a lot of innovations in the field. And some things, let's just say, some things just haven't worked, but some things have. And so we have to just continue replicating that. Just gonna give an example. HomeKey, that came out of the COVID pandemic, was an experiment, really. Now has become a nationally recognized model to acquire assets and convert them into interim and permanent supportive housing. Has created in record time, record cost. CEQA exemption, replicate what works. 13,000 units of interim and permanent supportive housing. By the way, a point of personal privilege here. In this conference, HCD is announcing the release of the third round of HomeKit, nearly $750 million announced in this conference to continue to creating more and more thousands of units for interim and permanent housing. So we know what works. We are working with different housing types to address the crisis, and just so much innovation happening. And the second critical part is we've done a lot in the state capital to provide funding and policy levers for local jurisdictions to take advantage of and create the 2.5 million new homes that we need by 2030. That's how big the gap is. And so what we need is accountability. We need local jurisdictions to step up from San Francisco all the way to Huntington Beach and everywhere in the middle to just use those policy levers and create their own at the local levels to continue to entitle and approve in record time all the housing, especially for low and moderate income people that we need. Those two things I think are critical.
Gotcha. Thank you. Pete, let me bring you into this. What's your aspiration and what do you think is critical?
So I think first and foremost, thank you for having me on the panel this morning. It's been a while since I've been to Housing California. It's good that it's in San Diego and not Sacramento because I could just drive right down the freeway and get here this morning. I think a few things. First, we must demand that housing is recognized as a human right and is viewed through a social determinants of health lens. We must push to ensure our budgets reflect things that actually make us safe. The criminalization of poverty must end immediately, and those resources must be returned to our communities in the form of housing and services. The historic applications and contemporary impacts of structural racism must be acknowledged and repaired. From Jim Crow to redlining to racial covenants and forced displacement and so on and so forth. Yes, reparations must be granted to African Americans, Native Americans, and this country can't move forward without that. California must be a leader in housing preservation. We must create a model of social housing that enhances communities and does not create islands of dissent. We must have a real conversation about affordability and do everything in our power to stop the inflow into houselessness. We saw what was possible during the COVID-19 pandemic if only we had addressed this endemic at the same time. Housing and rent subsidies are needed more now than ever as rent increases continues to outpace the wages of poor Californians, and the COVID-19 eviction cliff is poised to devastate our communities. Where tool sheds are not considered housing and all models of housing are explored, modular, 3D, container, prefab, eco-hoods, traditional build. I want to see a California that solves houselessness and it realizes it's a byproduct of housing availability, affordability, poverty, and structural racism. A California that does not have cities like Los Angeles, losing 5 houseless Angelenos per day in one of the world's largest economies. A California that returns publicly owned land and structures to the public for adaptive reuse housing. A California where housing is in fact a human right.
All right, thank you, Pete. Thank you, Pete. Corinne, sorry to have you follow that, but what's your aspiration?
That was beautiful, indeed. I'm going to focus my remarks on homelessness, and I think we all know and have felt the historic state investments in ending homelessness. And this is also at a really important time of cross-sector collaboration. You can't invite me and then expect me not to talk about CalAIM, so I am going to do that a little bit later. But I think for our agency, the California Health and Human Services Agency, this is also a time of intentional prioritization and focus on those with the most complex care needs that we're serving through our health and social services safety net system. And it's also about a focus on serving people with the most complex behavioral health conditions and providing the care and support that are needed for people to attain long-term recovery and long-term housing stability. So some folks may have caught the Governor Newsom's State of the State tour over 3 days last week. But if you didn't, I'm going to give you the cliff notes on the last stop on the State of the State tour, which happened actually in San Diego last Sunday, where the governor unveiled a behavioral health modernization reform proposal. And there are 3 really important parts of that proposal that I want to make sure that people are tracking and are aware of. The first is, I think, of a special interest to this crew because it is a bond, a general obligation bond measure. The proposal is that it would create both residential and housing resources for people in California with complex behavioral health conditions. So this is about creating the types of housing that can serve people who might be in more restrictive institutional settings, for people who may be able to be diverted from criminal justice impact, and people who are cycling through hospitals and our streets across the state. The second part is around our Mental Health Services Act in California, which is otherwise known as our millionaire's tax here in California, passed just about 20 years ago. And this is an opportunity to really bring it to today and to really get back to the original intent of the MHSA, which was to serve people with behavioral health conditions with the most complex care needs. And a big part of the intent of the legislation, when you go back and look at the conversations that were happening, was that this was about addressing homelessness and ending homelessness for people with behavioral health conditions. So a part of our proposal is to dedicate about $1 billion in ongoing funding through that funding stream to be dedicated to the types of housing resources we know make a difference in ending homelessness, including things like rental subsidies. And then the third piece, well, I'll also just say one more thing about the MHSA reform proposal, is also about making sure that we're fully leveraging our federal Medicaid dollars. It's about acknowledging the needs of people with substance use disorder needs, treatment needs, and using those dollars to invest in that as well to serve people who have substance use disorders. And then also around increasing accountability of the work that we're doing through our behavioral health delivery system across the state. And then the third piece of the proposal is around improving access for all Californians, including people who have commercial insurance, and really making sure that our systems of care, including the commercial plans, are doing what they should do so we don't have folks that ultimately end up in our public system because of the failure of our broader system to meet people's needs. So if folks want to be engaged and learn more about this work, check out our Modernizing Behavioral Health. Just Google Modernizing Behavioral Health and our agency, California Health and Human Services Agency, and there's information there about how to get engaged in this work. We really want to make sure that the housing advocates are engaged in this conversation, so I'll be reaching out to many of you to help us as we move forward and putting some meat on the bones of this particular proposal.
All right, thank you. All right, Amanda.
All right. So I'm going to say amen to Pete and stay on that street a little bit. When I think about the future of housing, I want us to be clear about what we are talking about and what we're not talking about. And a lot of times, I've seen recently us talk about equity and justice and really not define the difference between those two, right? Mm-hmm. Racial equity is an important first step. We like to use the definition from the Philanthropic Institute from Racial Equity that distinguishes equity and justice by saying, a racial equity lens separates symptoms from causes, but a racial justice lens brings into view the confrontation of power, the redistribution of resources, and the systemic transformation necessary for real change. Justice requires urgent fundamental changes that reposition communities of color in relation to power and resources, which includes being able to challenge and shape the many institutions that determine a community's condition. But what does that really mean when we're talking about housing? Equity is living in the current system and saying, we're gonna tweak around the edges, we're gonna try to adjust disparities, but justice demands that we think about what does it mean to go upstream and ask why people are becoming housing insecure and homeless and address that before they go through that trauma. Justice demands that we give people agency and power over where and how they live, and don't think impact is just moving someone to the next most affordable place away from their community, away from transportation, away from jobs, and that they get to determine where they live. Justice means that people get to determine for their communities what safety looks like, what community looks like, and that's not determined by some revitalization effort, but it's determined by the community. And I think lastly, justice and the future of housing, what that means, and I'm going to call in what my good friend Peggy Bailey, who's the Vice President for Housing for the Center on Budget and Policy, always says, that we need to not measure our success by proximity to whiteness. And so justice means that neighborhoods get to be designed by people of color, by Black and Indigenous people who've been most impacted. And it doesn't mean that a good neighborhood is proximate to whiteness. And so that's what we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about the difference between equity and justice and the future of housing. Do people have the agency and power to decide where and how they live?
Thank you. And thank you, all of you all. I mean, that is a compelling vision for the future for us. Pete, I want to come back to you, and I'm going to actually ask all of you all a set of questions that are a little bit different takes on the kind of same thing, which is kind of how do we weave together the different specializations that exist in the field in order to get to where we want to go. And Pete, I'll start with you. And one of the things that's interesting about the field is, we've got people who represent just so many different kind of angles on the housing issue. We've got folks who focus in on housing units and developing more housing units. We've got also folks who are really focusing in on the people who live in that housing. How do we make sure they have the best living conditions possible? We also have people who are thinking about developing communities, and housing is an angle towards getting there. We've got folks who represent the people who build the housing. So, I mean, we've just got a whole really diverse field of people who are specializing in different components of the issue. And despite all of that fragmentation, I think everybody understands that it all has to come together in order for us to get to where we want to go. How do we thread these areas of work together in a way that has impact for the communities that we're really caring about and that we've been talking about so far?
Yeah, so I think I would just add one more category. You have folks like me who have been organizing around housing as a human right since the 90s, right? An organization, the Los Angeles Community Action Network, that would not allow other folks to define who we are and who we were. We're based in the 50 square block community of Skid Row, downtown Los Angeles. And folks immediately were like, you're a homeless organization, and we quickly redefined that 2 decades ago to houseless, right? Not homeless, houseless, because our communities are our homes. Our ways of developing our safety nets is our home. And so for us, when we think about these divisions, we're community organizers, but now we're also community developers. We have a model of housing that we're erecting in South Central Los Angeles that's called EcoHoods, and I'll come back to EcoHoods after I answer your question. I think there's room for everyone. I think everyone, not sounding cliche, I think everyone has to be in. But there needs to be an alignment that's motivated by some set of values or some set of morals. And I think from the ground floor, that definition has got to be lifted from those on the bottom, from those in the neighborhoods. Those in the neighborhoods have the skills, have the agency, have the innovation, right, to move forward ideas that, we turn on television that are already repurposed and duplicated. I also think that a lot of what we're talking about is competition, right? And we have to think about power. We have to think about resources. We have to think about proximity to resources. We have to think about those who are determining what our communities should look like. And so it's this transfer of power that has to happen. It's not an either or, it's an and both, but an and both driven from the bottom, driven from communities that are currently, particularly communities like mine in South Central, that are targeted for removal. right? Either by force or banishment or gentrification, right? We know what we need, we know what we want. We're looking for partnerships that equal playing fields and power sharing.
Got you. Thank you. Associata, we talked about this in the prep. The housing development field is a highly technical one. I often say that financing affordable housing is probably the closest thing I've seen to rocket science. And, it requires you to go to a variety of sources and entities that, a lot of folks really just aren't familiar with. And I'm curious as to whether you see kind of these movements around housing as a human right, social housing, that kind of stuff. Is that an opportunity to demystify the kind of housing development maze, if you will, and kind of bring to higher relief kind of the complexity of this stuff for folks who are advocating for a different reality?
Sure, absolutely, I believe that. It is, yes, very complicated, and how can we uncomplicate things? And that is getting involved in the conversation. It is informing, it is having the back and forth and understanding kind of where developers, the producers, where we're coming from and what the challenges are that we have to do what we all want to do, which is to house people here in California. And so that gets very, very complicated. And for those of us who have been in this space, really believe that it is important that we are having those conversations and sharing and figuring out, and not just having the conversations, but also listening. It's a big part of coming to a solution that I think that we can all move forward with, is really listening and understanding where the other person is coming from and why and what's driving each person. But kind of going back to thinking about like having one centered mission, centered values, that's moving us, that's really important. But that's absolutely having and learning having those conversations, and also not just looking at it from all aspects, not just the operation side of things, because a lot of times we want to make sure we're focused on getting it off the ground. And then the other piece of it too, because community housing works, we own our properties for 55 years plus. So we look at this as not just one standing community, but how we're impacting the community at large as well. And so with that, we have a different mindset in how we're approaching things. And so having those types of conversation and knowing that whoever is involved, making sure that the community is involved. How do we get the community involved? With development, construction, how do we involve, how do we look for opportunities, go into the neighborhood, having people give the opportunities to train, to do work, construction work, to get involved in the work that they're doing, so providing skills, and also giving the opportunity to contribute to their community and stay in the community. I think that's a big part of all of these conversations too, is that we want to make sure that people who grow up in a certain neighborhood, we want to make sure that people are given the opportunity to continue to thrive there as that community, and having those resources and thinking through those different types of resources and opportunities all start with conversations and the collaborations that need to happen.
Yeah, thank you. Gustavo, so when we were talking a little bit earlier, I was asking you how Sacramento, and you basically were saying you're never there, that you're up and down the state and all over. And so, you've got a chance to see, the diversity of geography within the state of California, urban, rural, suburban, north, south, inland, coastal, all that stuff. How do we develop a strategy that kind of is responsive to the unique characteristics of the diverse parts of the state, while also rolling that up to a kind of statewide agenda?
Thanks, Fred. First, let me say it's great that how you describe the ecosystem, sort of the maze, and appreciate some of the answers. I mean, part of why we have convenience like that is to, for all of us to fully network and understand that ecosystem and learn from each other. And just the fact that we've been kind of away from convenience like this for so long because of COVID. Maybe there's a bit of a delay in that kind of networking. So I'm glad that we're all back together, learning from each other. But geography, no matter where you are in the state, when we are speaking about housing and geography, we're really speaking about the geography of opportunity. It's not a new concept. Housing is foundational to everything else in life. When we choose a place to call home, we're not only looking at, the conditions of, the walls that surround us or the roof over our heads. That's shelter. That's not home. Home is community, is, the opportunity to know sort of the conditions of the community, access to opportunity, the proximity to jobs and schools and the quality of those jobs and schools, the different options for transportation so that we don't just rely on one mode of transportation, but we have multiple options. How clean the water we drink is, how clean the air we breathe is, what kinds of healthcare facilities and options for healthcare do we have nearby, the quality of food options that we have near our home. So all of that encompass access to opportunity, safety in the streets, amenities that we all think of when we, especially for families with young children, so that they know, as President Obama reminded us, zip code is more of a determinant of a success in life than your own DNA. It is true. I mean, this has been studied for decades, and we know it is true that community dictates in many, many ways, your success in life. So we have to continue to think of this access to opportunity, no matter where in the state you are. There's a lot of conflict sometimes in relation to is the state subsidizing more housing in the urban core, suburban. What about rural? I mean, it's just no matter where you are, we have to, there's plenty of goal setting to do with 2.5 million new homes that we have to create roughly in the next 7-8 years. And we are partnering very closely with regions, planning organizations, councils of governments. We are working very closely with local jurisdictions. And the one, other than health, the other determinant, crystal clear, that is happening right now at the state is the connection between our climate goals and our housing goals. We're very focused. Governor's ambitious climate goals in historic also investments in reducing the harmful effects of climate change. We are laser focused at the state, working with regions and localities to think about the connections of reducing the effect of vehicle miles traveled, that proximity to jobs, to kind of the centers where we reduce the harmful gas emissions. 42% of greenhouse gas emissions continue to be related to transportation, the combustion engine. So we have to work on that. We have to work on that and the effects of drought. Thankfully, we've had a good year, but it could just be episodic. We're going to continue to see drought in the state of California. We're going to continue to see wildfires. So climate change is giving us really a wake-up call in order to also examine how the housing market continues to produce communities, create communities of opportunity.
Got you. Thank you. Amanda, one of the things that strikes me about the work that we do is that you can walk into a room of folks who are like kind of thinking about affordable housing and affordable housing development, walk out of that room and then go into a room for people who are thinking about kind of how we meet the needs of folks who are unhoused. And as you go from one room to the other, you seldom see the same people in the room. It's almost as if they're like two completely different ecosystems. Is that a problem in terms of what we're trying to accomplish? If so, how do we address it? And if it's not a problem, why not?
It absolutely is a problem. This is changing, but I would say 7 years ago, a big part of my work at Funders Together to End Homelessness, we're a national network. We spend a lot of time in California, obviously, because of the regional and the statewide work we do here. But traveling around the country, I would tell people I work for Funders Together to End Homelessness, and people in the housing field would be like, oh, that's interesting. I don't do homelessness, I do housing. I don't know what that means, folks, because the solution to ending homelessness and preventing homelessness is housing. So I'm gonna say to the folks here and have a FAM conversation, if you're working on housing and not thinking about housing for all people, and you think about homelessness as an individual problem, not a systems failure, you are perpetuating oppression and marginalization.
Say that.
So it is a huge problem. I think it's getting better. I think those rooms are merging. I think about the work that we're doing at the national level with the National Coalition for Housing Justice, where it is a group of folks who are in the homelessness field, the low-income housing field, saying that we can't prevent or end homelessness or address low-income housing without a housing justice or a racial justice lens, and we need to be thinking about it all and our relationship to housing. But on the other side of that, and I know philanthropy perpetuates this too, we always say to folks, you can't work in silos, but we work in silos as well. And so we often say to funders, everyone is a housing funder. If you care about environmental justice, if you're reforming the criminal legal system, if you're working with children, if you're working in health, you are a housing funder. And so on philanthropy side, we need to stop that as well. And those separate rooms where people say, oh, we are doing this type of housing. No, we're doing housing for all. And then lastly, to the folks in the room who I call, and I mean this with kindness and love, who maintain the nonprofit industrial complex mainstream housing idea that only they can do housing, when the reality is the people who see the housing crisis first are not those mainstream organizations. They are the by and for-led organizations on the ground who do everything in the community, including housing. They are the aunts on the streets, they are the tias, they are the folks who see the housing crisis, and we exclude them from that conversation until we want to extract from them and create systems to address the historic marginalization. That is not authentic collaboration, and we certainly need to also think about the silos between the mainstream folks who do housing and the people with lived experience and lived expertise. So it's a big problem, and we need to solve it.
Thank you. Corinne, for you, usually by the time someone becomes unhoused, they have experienced multiple failures from multiple systems. Yet we don't see the kind of alignment that we think we need across those systems in order to meet people as the whole people that they are. Yeah. What have you seen as some lessons in trying to do better alignment across systems? And are there things that we haven't been doing in this regard that we need to be paying more attention to?
Yeah. So I'll start by saying I have one of those job titles that's sort of like hard to decipher what it is. I do policy and strategic planning. But I think I want to share that a big part of my job is really trying to do that silo busting that exists in our service delivery system, and to make sure that we are, in fact, serving the whole person. I think that what's really important about this question is that it's getting at the fact that, like you said, many people who become homeless occur due to a failure of our system to be able to wrap ourselves around someone to meet their complete needs. But I do think that there is reason to be hopeful in this moment right now. And there are two places where I think we, within our agency, have made significant investments, both in housing interventions and the supportive services that go along with them. And that is one in our social safety net delivery programs and in our healthcare system. So on the social services side, our Department of Social Services here in California has a housing and homelessness division and is responsible for 7 programs that really embed housing supports, including rental subsidies, into our social safety net delivery system. And we've invested about $2 billion over the last 2 years in resources to expand that embedded social delivery system piece. We are serving 2 main populations. We're serving families experiencing homelessness across the state. So we have 2 programs that serve people who are a part of our CalWorks program across the state, and we have a program that also provides housing resources for people in the child welfare system to be able to keep families together or to return families together who may have been separated by providing housing resources for those families. And then we also have programs that are really designed to serve seniors and people with disabilities who are either homeless or at risk of homelessness. And we do one through our Adult Protective Services program, and that's a program for seniors who are survivors of neglect or abuse, and that's embedding those housing resources, including rental subsidies and housing navigation and prevention resources into that program. We also have another program that provides disability benefits advocacy so that people can access disability benefits alongside investments in housing resources and housing case management. We also, folks may have, hopefully, many of you are probably even a part of our Project Room Key effort, which provided non-congregate sheltering during the pandemic for people, especially seniors and people with disabilities in response to COVID-19. And then lastly, we administer a program called the Community Care Expansion Program, which is a capital fund that can provide resources for assisted living settings as well as permanent supportive housing for people with more complex care needs who need supports to be able to live independently. So I think of these Department of Social Services programs as really being the embodiment of meeting people where they are at and doing whatever it takes to serve people as they are integrated into our social safety net delivery system. And then the second place where this work is happening that's worth lifting up is through our Department of Healthcare Services, where we're taking what I would consider really big steps in being able to address the social determinants of health. And both Pete and Gustavo brought this up, and I appreciate you bringing it up because, as Medi-Cal, which is one of our biggest tools to address equity as a state, is taking on the fact that we need to be looking at housing as a part of our healthcare delivery system. We know that we talk, folks. I think I'm preaching to the choir when we say that housing is so important to improve someone's health that it's the kind of thing that ought to be able to be written on a prescription pad, and we are taking steps to get us there in the state of California. CalAIM, which is our Medi-Cal, big multi-year Medi-Cal reform effort, has established programs that can provide both temporary housing, that can provide resources for beneficiaries to help find and then maintain their housing, and that tenancy supportive services to help people long-term stay in their housing. And I'll say that we'll continue to push the envelope in California with the federal government. And I hope we have some federal partners here today who I can come find and talk to. And we're submitting a waiver which would allow us in California to be able to provide up to 6 months of rental subsidy and temporary housing for certain Medi-Cal beneficiaries funded through our federal Medicaid funding to do this work in a really ongoing way. So keep an eye on that one. I just want to say again, I really appreciate this topic. You may have touched on my favorite topic to talk about. And I think the work ahead of us and for all of us in the room is to work on bringing this work to scale. It's happening in various corners of our state, but now our work is to make sure that every single Medi-Cal beneficiary who needs it can access these resources. And so this is my call to action for folks in the room who are service provider partners or housing providers who want to learn more about how you can be involved in this whole CalAIM thing, is to learn about the PATH program, which is our Providing Access and Transforming Health program, which will help our social services providers, our homeless services providers, our housing providers build capacity to be a Medi-Cal provider through CalAIM and to bring more of these, take advantage of these federal resources and bring them to scale all across the state. So you can find information on that in our Department of Healthcare Services website. Look up PATH, or come find me if you're interested in learning more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I want to shift gears, and I want to start with you, Pete, as I do so. Over the last few years, we've heard more kind of conversation than we have in decades about reparations and reparative approaches to the work that people are engaged in. And you, at the top, talked about how much of our housing system and the inequities in it have roots in structural racism, from slavery to the fake promises of Reconstruction, to Jim Crow, to blockbusting, redlining, housing discrimination. I can just go on and on and on. There have been a number of overtly racist policies and approaches that have gotten us to where we are today. It fascinates me how we can think that we can reverse that without having equally racially focused solutions. As you think about this work, the structural racism that's embedded in it, how are you thinking about the critical reparative work that needs to take place in the housing field? And what solutions do you see as essential? And what roles do you think housing folks need to be playing in this conversation?
Well, that's a small question, isn't it?
And if you could do that maybe in,
No, exactly. In 30 seconds,
Exactly.
we'd all be good, right?
Look, even Siri's trying to weigh in.
Yes. I'm gonna figure out how to answer that question. Because as I sit here thinking about that question, there was so much that was said, of the last question that I just wanted to lean in on. Mm-hmm. So many things that Gustavo said, Amanda, so many things that you said, that I feel needs just further interrogation, right? The idea that we can be in rooms, particularly on the affordable housing development side, and we hear things like, well, it just doesn't pencil, right? That project just doesn't pencil for those folks, right? Or we can't build housing, for folks under, 35% of area median. Like that in and of itself is barring or locking out those most in need, right? When we're having those conversations, when that's the model that we're following, or in a place like Los Angeles where one unit of permanent supportive housing costs almost $1 million, from $800,000 to $1 million, right? You can get a single family home for $1 million. And what they say about that cost is, in Los Angeles, the cost of land is just so expensive. I'm an organizer, and so we forced, and I swear, Fred, I'm gonna get to this question, but this conversation was just so good, I just had to hop in this way, right? Or I might pass the last part over to Amanda. But when in Los Angeles, and this is where we have to ask questions and we have to interrogate. So in Los Angeles, they say the cost of building is so high because the land costs are so much. So we force an audit out of our controller. And what does this audit show us in terms of every dollar that goes into that $1 million of housing? We find that 50% of the building of the house goes into labor. Makes sense. We find another 40% goes into something called soft costs, right? Professional services, fees, permits. And that only 10% of the costs actually go to the cost of land. And so for me, if we take for face value what people are telling us about what it takes to build, and we're running with that, someone's telling big, bold lies. And we believe that the community can get more for their money than $1 million per unit. When we think about houselessness, we've written about this, have talked about this, have lectured about this. And I think we finally, in the George Floyd moment, we finally got a little light in terms of who's houseless and why, right? We were able to write about, the causes of, particularly in the Black community, the causes of houselessness, of course, structural racism, of course, housing, segregation, redlining, but also deindustrialization, also the prison industrial complex, also the shortcutting of AFDC at the time, right, and NAFTA, right? And so we have to look at all of the structural causeways that lead to communities, the Black community I'm speaking of now, but we should also talk about the brown community, which in the last decade has been silently creeping up in terms of their numbers of houselessness. Mm-hmm. The solution for me, when we talk about these things, particularly reparations, we need that, right? We need reparations, we need reparations, we need reparations today. It's interesting, I was reading an article yesterday that showed the country, particularly white folks, were like, slavery happened so long ago, we don't need to give Black folks any resources. That was so long ago. But then they're talking to the son of a mother whose mother was a sharecropper, right? And so I hear stories from my mother from the South about picking cotton in Diboll, Texas, from my mother. So that doesn't seem that far away. When we talk about reparations, yes, we have to talk about reparations in the form of money, in the form of services, in the form of resources, in the ways of land back, right? Getting back what was stolen from us, right? Reparations is necessary. I think the last thing I'll say is that in an absurd way, particularly when we talk about houselessness, folks' proximity to houselessness has shifted, right? And so, whereas it used to be a problem in someone else's neighborhood, or it was just that person's community, we did a research project with Loyola that showed in Los Angeles, all renters were touched. Asian renters, 52% of Asian renters in this sample of 1,300 folks had problems paying rent in the last 12 months, right? 64% of Black folks had problems paying rent, right? 53% of white folks and Latinos, roughly the same, had problems paying rent. And so we see that with this proximity to houselessness shifting, the acceptance, we got you, I see that note, they're like, get them. The acceptance to solutions have also shifted, right? Where housing can be built, right? Now, it's not really out the kindness of the heart, it's that everyone is feeling the crunch. And so now is an opportune time to create housing for all Californians.
Thank you, Pete. Gustavo and Corinne, just for either one or both of you, I mean, the state and the governor has put together a reparations task force. Some of us have been following that work very closely. How do you see the intersection between that work and the work that you all are engaged in?
You want me to start? Sure. Well, this task force on reparations the governor put together, it's unique. It's really first of its kind. I mean, the one domain where it is crystal clear the relationship between society's action, government-sponsored action, and the harmful effects of structural racism is in the housing marketplace. I mean, it is crystal clear. And this task force that the governor put together has in it a task to also measure the extent of harm in terms of housing discrimination and the legacy of racial segregation. And so I have to say, I think the governor's foresight on this is, his intent is clear. His desire to do something about it is clear. And it needs to happen. A few years ago, I was preparing for a Senate confirmation hearing to become a fair housing head at HUD in the Obama administration, and I went back and looked at the congressional record and some of the findings of, for example, the Kerner Commission back in 1967 that happened just before the assassination of Dr. King, and then the passage a year later of the Fair Housing Act. And we know that in that Kerner Commission congressional report, it points to example after example after example of the kind of government-sponsored measures that led to the redlining and to the lending that just shut out Black Americans from opportunity. And we are just, I think we've made a lot of progress, but sometimes, I wonder, where are we right now when the homeownership rate for Black Americans is the lowest it's been in 50 years. And, you talk about kind of the increase of other minorities in the state of California, and also comparing, where they live, how they live, what kind of wealth building they're increasing compared to other communities. It's just, the disparities are still very blatant. And we're looking forward to this unique task for reparations. Again, just Governor foresight is incredible here. And I would just end before Corinne goes next that very recently, and this news may have been on a bit of notice for many people, very recently the governor signed a piece of legislation about a family, the Bruce family. Did you all see that news?
I'm the sponsor.
Is that right? Yeah. Is that right? Okay, so this is the type of measure. I'm going to just briefly read. This was a very quick quote that the governor did when he decided to sign this law to return Bruce's Beach back to the Bruce's family, an African-American family this property was stolen from them. It says, as we move to remedy this nearly century-old injustice, California takes another step further in our commitment to making the California dream a reality for communities that were shamefully shut out by a history of racist exclusion. And that's how this law returns this property back to this Black American family that was stolen from. So we need to just be very conscientious about this work, one step at a time. And I'm looking forward to see what this reparations task force will lead towards.
Thank you. Corinne, anything?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add two places, I think, where the initial recommendations that have come out of the task force, I think, touch the work that we're doing at our agency and that we're all trying to collectively do. And the first was a recommendation to pass legislation that makes education, substance use, and mental health treatment and rehabilitation programs the first priority for incarcerated people. And I think this is important for us because there are dismally high rates of exits to homelessness from correction settings and a real lack of connection to services, which is a deeply important health equity issue. So I want to share with folks, make sure people are tracking that the Department of Healthcare Services recently launched, as a part of the CalAIM package, the Justice Initiative, which in January of this year, California became the first state in the nation approved to offer a targeted set of Medicaid services to youth and adults who are exiting carceral settings prior to release. And this is really about making sure that we can increase the uptake of and continuation of Medi-Cal coverage and being able to improve the coordination and care for people who are exiting incarceration so that they're going to healthcare systems and to community-based organizations that can meet their needs. And this is also just a part of a broader set of health reform efforts that are designed to provide culturally competent and trauma-informed care for folks. And then the second place is that the task force recommends that we identify previous and current, important current, policies and practices that overwhelmingly contribute to the vast overrepresentation of African Americans among the unhoused population. I just want to let folks know that through our California Interagency Council on Homelessness, which is made up of 18 state bodies and 2 community representatives. If people aren't tracking, we'd love for you to follow our work at the California Interagency Council on Homelessness. As a part of our state action plan, this year we'll be standing up a racial equity working group that has a couple of really important goals. One, to expand the range of strategies that we have in our toolkit at the state to address racial inequities in our system, to analyze our data more effectively around access to state programs and also outcomes, especially for BIPOC communities in our housing delivery systems, and then also to refine our procurement process to ensure more equitable distribution of funds to historically marginalized communities, including tribal communities. So we'd love for you to stay engaged in this work if folks are interested. Once again, come find me and we'd love to engage you in this work.
Thank you. Thank you. Amanda, you talked a little bit earlier when we were talking about the vision around justice and liberation as it relates to the work that you all are engaged in and why it's important to think about it that way. I would imagine that this conversation has made its way into your discourse. What are you seeing in philanthropy around this, and what kind of leadership would you like to see from philanthropy on this topic?
Yeah, so I want to just real quickly take a point of personal privilege. I think we can't have a conversation about reparations without acknowledging where that conversation started. Recently, one of the first people to talk about reparations in a meaningful way in our country, Randall Robinson, passed away on Friday. He happens to be the brother of my pastor, so it's been a very difficult time for us. And he always made the connection and the case for reparations at the government level. And I want to say, to all due respect to my government folks, just a reminder that true reparations does not come with strings attached. It doesn't come in program interventions. It is just turning over resources to people and allowing them to do whatever they want to do with that money, whether that's take care of their housing, take care of their health, go on vacation, go on sabbatical. And so think about that deeply as you're preparing your work, that reparations is not tied to programs. We've made a great case and understand that reparations is needed because of the harm of government, but in philanthropy, we don't often talk about how philanthropy was born on the backs of stolen land, chattel slavery, and the free labor that built the businesses and the economy of this country, right? And so philanthropy owes reparations as well. One of our members, John Kimball, in the beginning of the pandemic, got on a phone call with me and just said, you know what, Amanda, I don't know what we're doing here because there's $1 trillion of assets in philanthropy, and we just need to turn it over, particularly to poor Black women, and just fund them like we trust people. And that is the work of reparations in philanthropy and in government, is to resource people, particularly poor Black and Indigenous women, like we actually trust them, and not create these barriers and layers that don't just say, you get to do with what you want with the resources. I would say finally, though, because I think a step to get to reparations and liberation is to realize that often we fund the fight, but not the recovery. And so we are deep in funding the fight to get us to housing justice, but we're not thinking about what does it mean to heal and recover and to give people rest and rejuvenation and the ability to have agency and power over their lives. That's also a part of reparations, is to not continue this idea that our worth is caught up only in our work and what we can produce. And that means thinking real deeply about the ways in which we're trying to change our work and not just create these continued systems of oppression. So as we're thinking about things like direct cash transfers and guaranteed basic income and eventually reparations, Let's make sure that we're not putting it on what I call the layer cake of racism, where we put seemingly good resources and ideas and policies on top of really bad cake and expect to get a different outcome. So that means let's not create shadow systems of oppression in our efforts to repair harm.
Thank you. Thank you. Associata, in our prep call, you talked about the importance of diversity in the pipeline, folks that are working in this field. Can you talk about how you see the relationship between that and efforts to repair harm? And while she does that, we're going to close out with one sentence around what excites you. So while she's talking, I want you all to think about your sentence. Go ahead.
Sure. I grew up in this industry, and shout out to CCRH internship program where it focuses on diversity and bringing all different voices, all different colors into the conversation and providing people with the background, with the information, with the education, and then also, and the training and the connections. And that's what we need. We want to make sure that everything that we've been talking about here carries on. And in order for us to do that, and then also looking at the equity side of things, making sure that we are keeping it diverse, making sure that we're reaching in and providing the resources, right? Our organization, we're not only builders and owners, but we also provide resources. We serve our communities, families, just people, and introducing them to the work that we do. You know, whether it's advocating for housing, whether it's conversations about social justice, how does that connect with housing? Those are all the things that we want to bring in and bring up. And also just creating that path and trusting in the people that we are training to lead us into that future. And it's so important to have that. And for those of us that are here and that have been here for a number of years, you know, being aware that keeping it to ourselves is a disservice, not only to the organization we serve, the communities we serve, but as a state at large. We're doing a disservice to ourselves if we're only keeping it to ourselves. We need to be sharing that information so that new folks can take it and add their spin to it and be creative and take us into the next space.
All right, thank you. Amanda, what's exciting you?
What excites me is we're finally doing this work in collaboration, in authentic collaboration, seeding and seeding, both the S and the C, power to people with lived experience and lived expertise. And as a result, I believe we will examine our relationship with housing and start to think about decommodification, so housing is really a human right.
Thank you. Corinne.
Yeah, I'm excited about a cool new study that UCSF is doing. It's our statewide study on homelessness. I think what's exciting about this study is not only that it's the largest in-depth study of its kind in California and possibly in the country, but there are so many insights, I think, that can help us drive good policy in California and other parts of the country. This study really gets at some of the themes that we've been digging into today around a lack of connection and holes in our social safety net, around the complex care needs of people living on the streets in our state, the impact of the justice system and racial inequities. And I think these are the kinds of themes that are begging for creative policy solutions that I think are represented by the brains in this room. And so really looking forward, it'll soon to be released, but if you want a sneak peek, you can come learn about it today at 3:45. I don't know if I'm allowed to try to call people to come to our session, but we look forward to talking about it later today and to sharing the results broadly in the next couple of months.
Thank you. Associata.
I don't know if I can do it in one sentence, but I'm really looking forward to asking the tough questions and engaging in those complicated questions of what is the outcome we're really looking for, and why are we making it so complicated? Do we have to make it that complicated? I'm looking forward to the conversations surrounding how can we address these things together as we move forward. And yeah, it's in a space, I feel like we're in a space of discomfort, and that in that discomfort becomes transformation. And I'm trying to live into that.
Gustavo.
My quick one sentence is his work. Housing is a human right. But I just want to say, very enthusiastic, the fact that roughly in the next 6 years, the last 5-6 years, we've made tremendous progress. The historic investments in homelessness programs and affordable housing have created nearly 55,000 new homes in the state of California. We have another 20,000 in the pipeline that has strong state and federal subsidy in them. We're making progress. Last year, the number of permits that were approved in the state of California reached a level that we haven't seen in roughly 8 years, 130,000 new homes permitted, but this year we're gonna achieve more, the next year more. We are making progress thanks to the ecosystem that is here convened, all of you working on this, whether it's from the advocacy point, from the tenant organizing point, from the development point, from the government, especially local government standpoint. So just want to say I'm enthusiastic about what I'm seeing, and let's just keep putting that foot on the pedal.
All right. Pete?
Yep, I'm excited by the promise of new leadership in Los Angeles. We recently elected Mayor Karen Bass, the first Black mayor, and that Mayor Bass is now carrying the agenda that people have laid out for the last decade. So everything around modular, everything from giving public land back, right? Like, she's not been in office 90 days, but doing things that others have said could not be done, and being in solidarity mostly with community, right? And so I'm excited about those possibilities. I'm excited about the possibility of moving beyond this beautiful tapestry of policy towards implementation. Yeah. We're really good at passing policy, not so good at implementation. So excited about being able to move toward implementation in this moment.
Thank you. Pete, Gustavo, Sociata, Corinne, Amanda, thank you for your thoughtfulness. Thank you for your work. Give them a round of applause, y'all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before you all head out, I want to give another round of applause and thank you for our plenary speakers for bringing their brilliance, their vision, and their inspiration. We have a few quick reminders. Please take a couple minutes during the break to visit the exhibition hall. HCD is hosting office hours. If you want to dig in with Gustavo, they'll be having office hours until 5 today. We're encouraging you to stay. We have Cara Herring, the amazing Cara Herring, who's going to do some morning movement with us. There were not that many of you on the lawn this morning with Cara, so I expect better turnout tomorrow. And then we look forward to seeing everyone back here at noon for our next plenary, where we'll be bringing together a wonderful group of leaders with lived experience to talk about the work that they're doing here in California.